Hello, everybody. It's me, Fiona, White Zulu, and welcome back to another chapter of White Zulu. I hope you're enjoying them. I'm certainly enjoying reading them out to you. And this part is chapter 14, Flora and Fauna up on the top of our farm. Now, I left you last time with a description of this amazing habitat of wildlife on the top of our farm, and I'm going to continue with it. Here I go into detail about the prolific wildlife, including the many species of wildflowers which grow up on top. The part of our farm which we call Lyndhurst, since there are so many habitats on our 5,000-acre ranch, New Forest, there's an unprecedented amount of different species of trees, plants, birds, and animals, ranging from deep in the forested valley right up to the plains and marshes up on the escarpment. There's a plethora of birds, greater double-coloured sunbirds, little iridescent emerald, scarlet, and purple hummingbird-like creatures which sip the nectar from the trumpets of wildflowers. There are malachite sunbirds too, slightly bigger, which drink from wild red salvia flowers. White-bellied sunbirds flit about, and the black sunbird with its gorgeous breast of iridescent purple feathers drink from the endless variety of flowers. Lower down in the valley, where the sugar bushes grow, which is just behind me here in my background, are the Cape sugarbirds with their long fawn tails. Over the flays, the sacabullas, the long-tailed widowbirds, flutter, dangling their magnificent broad and long pitch-black tails temptingly just above the grass in a mating display. There are also red-throated widows with shorter tails displaying over the veldt, and red-shouldered widows swoop and dance over the flays with golden and scarlet bishop birds. There are orange long-throated longclaws running along in the grass in front of our horses or vehicles, and yellow-bellied pipits as well. The sky above the veldt is filled with the snapping noises of the wings of the tiny brown airs cisticola in their display flight. There are all the different songs of larks, and finally, swooping gracefully in trailing squadrons, come all the white European storks from their long and perilous migration down from the northern hemisphere. They spend the summer here, with our 3 different types of cranes, eating the endless supply of frogs and grasshoppers. We also have white-backed vultures circling overhead, a short swoop from their roosts in the Drakensberg, and occasionally the lammergeier, the bearded vulture, famous for its bone-dropping techniques to get at the fatty marrow of carcasses, makes an appearance circling overhead. Great big solitary Stanley's bustard strut around the drier parts, sometimes just their heads visible above the long summer grass. They're very large birds in the bustard family and resident all year round. This species is always silent and a very rare sight in South Africa today, having suffered population declines through much if not all of its range. Hunting is the primary cause of declines across southern Africa, and conversion of grassland to agriculture is a greater threat. Whenever we ride or drive around the vast acreage of the veld and vleis, we always see secretary birds, large, very long-legged, almost terrestrial birds of prey, endemic to Africa and also very rare. It's a member of the diurnal raptors such as kites, buzzards, vultures, and harriers. It gets its name from a tuft of feathers on the nape, which looks like the old secretaries carrying their pencils behind their ears, or plumed pens, which is spread when attacking and misleads a snake's attack. Tree bird's favorite prey is snakes. The bird usually kills the snake with strong and precise kicks with its very long legs, and if it can't kill the snake on the ground, it raises it in the air and drops it over stones. It's enormous fun to watch a secretary bird with a long, big snake like the Cape cobra, which can be up to 6 feet long, hurling the unfortunate reptile around like a lasso. There are plenty of cuckoos in the summer months. My favorite is the aptly named emerald cuckoo with its green plumage, beautifully offset by a pale yellow belly. There are the green and white speckled Diedrich cuckoo with this distinctive 3-note call. The Klaas's cuckoo, which is also green, but has a snow-white belly. The European cuckoo arrives from its northern hemispheres, home for our bountiful summer's feeding. And there's the black cuckoo with its plaintive call. We also frequently hear Burchell's cuckoo, which calls before the rain and is thus known as the rainbird. It has an extraordinary bubbling call, which sounds like somebody's emptying a hot water bottle. And there are hawks, harriers, kites, swifts, and swallows everywhere. During the fish spawning season, we see ospreys carrying trout, nose forward, unlike African fish eagles, those magnificent birds, which are very distinctive in appearance with a mostly brown body and large, powerful black wings. The head, breast, and tail of African fish eagles are snow white, with the exception of the featherless face, which is yellow. The hook-shaped beak, ideal for a carnivorous lifestyle, is yellow with a black tip. Their feet have rough soles and are equipped with powerful talons in order to enable the eagle to grasp slippery aquatic prey. And we love to watch them swooping into the water-filled vleis and streams. Go from a beautiful, pristine waterfall at the top corner boundary and joins up the 4 vleis like beads on a string, the true source of the Mgeni River, which eventually spills into the Indian Ocean 100 miles downstream. Brown, filthy, and polluted. Only trouble with this paradise is the sudden and ferocious summer thunderstorms which loom out of the Drakensberg, their grumbling, blackened anvil-shaped clouds forming at top speed, so rapidly that when the storm breaks, there's nowhere to take cover. According to Grandpa, the land up there is full of iron ore, and this is what attracts the lightning. To prove it, he drove us around in the old Jeep, showing us places where the earth had been torn up in great furrows, as if a giant had taken a plough to them, with large pieces thrown over like one would kick a carpet over, revealing the earthy underneath and the grass still rooted and alive. That's what lightning does if there aren't any trees around, he said. But you're safe in a car. It's when you're out on horseback that you're in real trouble. I was frequently caught out on horseback in these crackerjack thunderstorms and had to resort to Grandpa's instructions, which were to jump off one's horse, pull off the saddle and bridle, and chase him as far away from you as possible. Then I had to yank out the stirrup leathers containing the steel stirrups and, with the bridle and its steel bit, drop them quickly on the ground, with just the saddle over my head to protect myself from big hailstones. I had to run away from the steel in the bridle and stirrups and in the opposite direction of my horse and lie on the grass as flat as possible, using the saddle to cover my head. Sometimes these storms went on for hours, as they'd wander away and then suddenly come back when the wind changed, and often the hailstones were the size of golf balls or bigger. Neither I nor my horses ever came to any harm, but we lost a lot of other stock to lightning. When the storm begins brewing, cattle automatically turn their tails to the wind, rain and hail, bunching their heads and shoulders together in a central communal circle, and get the best protection that way. Because their heads and shoulders are so tightly packed together, it only takes one big bolt of lightning to hit the group, killing anything up to 20 head of cattle with one strike. The same happens with sheep too, as they tend to bunch together the same way as cattle do. And Dad had even greater losses with his sheep. These were real blows to any farmer. These are real blows to any farmer, as the carcasses begin to putrefy rapidly once the hot sun has reappeared after the storm, and the electrocution had made the insides and guts of the animal boil and explode. There is no way the meat can be salvaged, so the only recourse is for the farmer to have them buried. This brings on another problem, as Zulus are too superstitious to touch anything that's been struck by lightning. They have a god of lightning, and they never want to anger him in any way, assuming he wanted the meat for a feast of his own. Burying these huge quantities of sheep or cattle corpses with no manual labor is a big problem. And I remember Dad had to go over and borrow a mechanical digger and front-end loader from his neighbor, Mike, and then had to get Mr. Bannatyne, his white farm manager, to dig deep furrows and tip the dead beasts in, finally covering them with a thick layer of earth. The Zulus are also superstitious about their huts getting struck by lightning, and they have a ritual before each impending storm. The women go out and tie knots in the grass around their huts excuse me, I still have this throat problem, chase all their poultry into their little wooden hooks and lock them in, and then gather all their families inside the main hut. They close the few wooden shutters, which serve as windows, throw a handful of salt out of the door to appease the god of lightning, and finally cower in the pitch dark, mumbling incantations to their ancestors, begging them not to allow the tribe to come to any harm. Now and again we'd read in our local newspaper that a cluster of native huts had been struck by lightning, the thatch catching fire, and all the occupants, anything up to 30 people, had perished. Our house in the valley, excuse me, sorry about this, cannot shake this bug off. Our house in the valley has extra tall lightning conductors, and the towering gum trees also act as conductors. So we should have felt safe, except that our Zulu nannies didn't understand conductors and kept to the same terrified, cowering ritual as they did in their huts, thereby frightening the life out of us children. There were accident reports from neighbours and friends who'd been on the phone when the line was struck by lightning and been horribly burned or even killed. Others, foolish enough to be in the bath during a storm, had been electrocuted by having the house struck by lightning, the bathroom pipes acting as conductors straight into the bath water. But once we'd had our first thunderstorm, the farm sprouted felt mushrooms, especially up on top. It looked as if there'd been a snowfall, there were so many. The rest of the year round, we wouldn't touch any mushrooms, as there was no way of knowing if they were safe or not. Although during the mushroom season, there appeared giant versions of the felt mushroom, some about a foot or long in diameter. The Zulus call them amakowe, which Masango would cook for us, although anything he didn't recognize, he threw away. Mushrooms were utterly delicious, and Masango cooked them every way possible. Fried for our breakfast, in omelettes, soups, and gorgeous rich stews, with a small amount of onion chopped in farm butter, lots of mushrooms, with milk added instead of stock, and thickened with cream. These crops would go on for weeks, or not appear at all for a couple of years, depending on when we get our first rains. And if there's an early thunderstorm, then we had a bumper crop. The Zulu women on the farm used to come to our kitchen door with big enamel washing up bowls full of them, balanced on their heads, and Mum would buy the mushrooms from them. When we went out riding, we'd take a jumper with us, not just for warmth, but to use as bags. We'd tie up the hole where the head goes, knot the wrists, turn them upside down and fill them with mushrooms, finally to snag the bulging sack-like jersey onto the saddle. Often, we'd have to ignore the bounty and just ride through drifts of the snowy white caps, as the deep freezers were full to the brim with cooked mushrooms, and there were more overflowing bowls in the pantries waiting to be eaten. We never got tired of them, and even the sheep and cattle ate them too, as did all the wildlife, especially the baboons. Excuse me. The scrub hares. Dad once received a message from Jamela via one of the cattle herd boys that there was a problem with a couple of our sheep, and he was driving the old Willie's Jeep up, taking me, age 7, in the back to open the gates. We went to Jamela's hut, where it stood right on the escarpment overlooking the next door Durrant's farm, and right over to Lyons Bush and Fort Nottingham, where Grandpa lived by then. The hut, with its few pens and a crush tacked on behind for lambing ewes and sheep which needed treatment, is half surrounded by a very necessary windbreak of massive gum trees, planted by Grandpa at the same time as he'd planted those around our house. This gave some shelter from the icy winds which come whipping down from the snow-covered Drakensberg in winter, and also prevents Jamela's hut from being buried in snow, as he had a wife and several children living with him who stayed there all year round too, and remained behind when he brought the sheep down into the valley for inoculations, shearing, dipping, and for sale. Mela was waiting to meet us and showed us the 2 sheep he'd found in trouble and had carried over his shoulders to the pens behind his hut. The first had been attacked by 1 or more black-backed jackals. Because they're smallish predators, about half the size of a sheep, size of a border collie, their method of killing is to hamstring the back of the animal and then, once it's down, eat as much flesh as it can manage. In the spring, which was now, they carried meat back in their bellies for their pups, disgorging it once they reached the den. All this time, the poor and unfortunate sheep was still alive. There it lay with one back haunch eaten almost right off, leaving just the white shin bone, tendon, and hoof still kicking. After a nod from Dad, Jamela quickly cut its throat and hung it upside down from a wire hook on a nearby gum tree branch to drain the blood out. The rest of the meat could be salvaged and shared out among our family, the manager and the farm staff. The second sheep had fly strike. This is uncommon up in the cooler veld of Lyndhurst, as the blowflies prefer the moister heat of the valley. But the sheep had had diarrhea, and blowflies had laid their eggs in the matted wool and fecal matter under the tail. We always cropped the tails of our lambs for this very reason, snipped off with a pair of sheep shears just after they were born. They're kinder, more humane methods these days. The maggots had eaten their way right into the sheep's flesh, leaving a deep and wide hole in its backside and groin. The entire wound was a heaving mass of wriggling white maggots. Jamela fetched a tin of Jay's fluid and diluted it with a little water from the nearby rain barrel. He poured the mixture over the maggots and they began to fall off and writhe on the grass. He repeated this procedure until there were a mere 100 or so maggots left in the gaping but clean pink wound. He then picked up a stick around the edge of which he'd twisted a generous hank of sheep's wool. Using it like a paintbrush, he dipped the woolly end into the jays and gently and carefully brushed out the last of the maggots. Dad told him to hoist both the jackal-eaten sheep and the blowfly one into the back of the jeep, and he got into the driver's seat and started the engine. "Wait, Nkosazana, I have something for you," said Jomela softly to me in Zulu. And he went back into his hut, reappearing with a Hessian sack loosely tied at the neck. "What is it?" I asked him. "Wait and see till you get home," he said, and I thanked him before I climbed into the cab with Dad, and we set off, bumping over the veldt and down the twisting, steep road back into the valley. The trip would have taken at least 3/4 of an hour, and I wasn't going to wait that long to look into my sack. I pried the string holding the sack open and stuck my hand in. I reached warm fur, almost woolly, and softer than any kitten's. And feeling cautiously around, I felt 2 tiny little forms which moved and nudged at my fingers. I opened the sack a little further, folding back the neck, and there sat 2 baby scrub hares, not too young to have been taken from their mother. They had bright little eyes and lovely snuffly noses. "I must have hand-raised them," chuckled Dad when I showed him my treasure. "He's a decent old munt, that one. Definitely got a gift with animals. I don't think I've ever lost an orphaned lamb since I've had him. He must have raised them on ewe's milk." I was delighted with my 2 new pets, and stroked them all the way home, luxuriating in the feel of their softness and enjoying the fact that they were completely unafraid of me. Their breathing was normal and contented, not the rapid heaving, panting of a terrified animal. "I love Jomela," I said happily as we bounced down the road at crawling pace. "Months are funny things," mused Dad. For once, in spite of having lost a sheep to a jackal and almost one to a blowfly, he was in a fairly expansive mood. We usually drove in silence if I was with him in the cab. That's why I always preferred to ride in the back with the dogs. But we hadn't brought them this time, as our trip up there was to work on 6 sheep, and they would just have been a nuisance. If you're a white man, you'll never get to understand them unless you've grown up with them like your great-grandfather, Grandpa, and I did, and like you are now," said Dad. The silence after that remark made me think he'd stopped talking. But when I stole a sideways glance at him, he was looking into the distance, far beyond the rutted track in front of the jeep, and obviously thinking. "You need to know their ways, as they do things completely opposite to us, Abelungu." I nodded. I'd often seen Dad discussing matters with Ngiti or other staff like his polo grooms. He continued, "For instance, interviewing a munt for a job, say, and he comes to your office, the first thing he'll do when it's his turn to see you is to sit down on the ground. Now, that's because in Zulu custom, It's forbidden for anyone to be physically above his elder or senior, especially his chief, who will usually be sitting on some kind of stool. With a white man, when somebody important comes into his presence, he'll stand up. That's when the first problem occurs. The white thinks the munt is too lazy or cheeky to stand up. Again I nodded, fondling the tiny velvety air I'd found between my fingers. I'd always understood why the staff sat down on the grass in front of Dad's office. The other thing is that a munt must never look at an elder in the eye, as that constitutes a challenge, continued Dad as he wrestled the play on the jeep's loose steering over the ruts and holes in the road, trying not to bump the maggoty sheep around in the back too badly. Whites interpret that as looking shifty and won't employ them. Even something as simple as a handshake between a white and a black man is complicated. We just shake hands, but they have a triple grip handshake, and each maneuver has to be followed carefully. This leads to all kinds of problems unless either party knows the other's ritual. I know about the handshake, I said. Dumi-san taught me ages ago. I was about to elaborate, but I remembered that I wasn't supposed to associate with Dumi or any of the others, so I quickly stopped and let Dad continue. If a Zulu gives you something, anything, like a piece of paper containing a reference, or the hat you've dropped, or anything for that matter, there is a ritual way in which he gives the item. He offers it in his left hand, with his right hand clasped on his arm, just under and behind his wrist. This is an ancient ritual, and they do it to one another too. It indicates that he's not intending to harm you, and that his right hand is visible and not holding a weapon. He doesn't do that with us, I said. That's because even though you're white, you're still a child. She'll follow the proper rituals when you're older, replied Dad. How much older? I asked. This ought to have been my last question, as I knew Dad could be easily irritated by what he considered pestering. When you reach the age of about 16, I suppose. That's when Zulus consider their children to become adults. I kept quiet after that and only jumped out to open and close the 3 or 4 gates on the rest of the way home. When we got back, Dad drove the Jeep into its little thatched garage and sent Mackay off to the Bannatynes' cottage, that's the farm manager, with a message about the sick sheep. I took my sack carefully back to the house to show Evelina my new pets. Mum was passing by and peered into the sack too. You'd better share them with your sisters. I'm sure Jamela didn't give them to you for yourself, she said briskly. They'll be all your 4 pets as far as I'm concerned. I was horrified. They were my baby scrub hares. Jamela had said nothing about sharing them with my sisters. Knew better than to argue with Mum, so I nodded and continued showing them to Evelina. She was less than impressed, baby hares were meant for the cooking pot as far as she was concerned, but she was pleased that I was so ecstatic with them. Show them to Mackay, and he'll make a place for them to live, she said kindly. And then come back and have your bath. Come back and have your bath. You're covered in sheep dung from that sack. Mackay had come back from his messenger's run. I intercepted him on the back veranda. There was no way I was taking the hares into the kitchen for Masango to see. He would have had their heads off and skinned, ready for supper, before I could blink my eyes. I showed Mackay the contents of the sack. "How? Is he no kwacha?" he exclaimed. I told him that they were a gift to me from Jamela, and we needed a place to put them. Even though it was late afternoon, Mackay quickly managed to knock up a wonderful hook made from pine planks. It was a square run about the size of one of our big Persian rugs, with chicken wire all around them, even on the bottom, so the hares couldn't burrow out. Neither could what Mum called hawks, but were actually yellow-billed kites, swoop down from the gum trees and snatch the little hares. I helped him carry it down to the lawn next to the tennis court, and he then put the finishing touches to it. A piece of corrugated iron was wired onto the top in one corner for shelter from sun or rain, a wooden box underneath that filled with lucerne and hay for food and warm bedding, as well as a square 5-gallon tin which had once contained sunflower cooking oil, which Mackay had cut in half and carefully washed out. This he wired into another corner of the rung for their drinking water. Being square, they wouldn't be able to knock it over, and we could fill it easily through the chicken wire. The best part of it all was that the lawn's lush green kikuyu grass sprang through the wire on the bottom of the run. Excuse me. And so the hares could nibble it to their heart's content. Mackay had also made a lift-up hatch in the wire on top of the run so that I could climb in. This I did immediately, and gently placing my hares in their box, lay down and watched. After a while, the two little creatures hopped out, and I could finally get a proper look at them. They were enchanting, buff-coloured with fine black speckles and pure white underparts. Their fluffy tails were black on top and white underneath, and being nocturnal, they had big eyes, and their ears were bigger than a rabbit's. Their most distinguishing feature was a snow-white patch about the size of a thumbprint on their foreheads, exactly between their ears. My sisters and I loved our new pets, and we spent many happy hours with them. We cuddled the fluffy baby hares and played with them for hours, as they were far more amenable than any of the cats, either our house cats or even the less docile stable cats, which slunk away into the sheds and hid among the bales of lucerne whenever they saw us. Admittedly, we didn't try and dress the hares up in our dolls' clothes more than once, because they didn't lacerate us by ripping at us with their claws as the cats did. They wriggled straight out of the garments, lacking the proper kind of legs to poke through the arms of little knitted blue cardigans. in the fashion of Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit. After the novelty had worn off for Delia and Nicolette had been sent back to St. Anne's, Diane and I especially continued with them, playing with them, giving them lucerne stalks to nibble and slivers of carrot and lettuce leaves filched from the veggie garden. Every morning Mackay dragged their enclosure a few yards along the lawn, leaving a square patch of manicured grass where they'd nibbled each blade through the netting underneath, revealing a bright green fertilized velvety surface like that of a bowling green, and he filled up their water can from the hose pipe. Even Mum was quite impressed. I wish I could get the whole lawn to look that well cut. That blasted mower could never get such an even trim, however low Beg and Lela sets it. Once they were fully grown, the hares became too restless to be kept in captivity. So with our permission, Mackay let them go back into the veld, where they could find mates and raise babies of their own. We were quite philosophical about it, as we knew it was the best for them. And when we were coming home from polo tournaments in the pitch dark and saw a hare zigzagging in front of our car, too hypnotized by the headlights to have the sense to hop up onto the grassy bank and out of harm's way, we'd speculate as to whether those were our pets or, years later, their offspring. That's all for this time. Want to thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. I also want to thank John Muslane very much for enabling me to make these videos. Without him, I couldn't do it, and I'm very grateful to him. And if you want to see a lot more information and photographs from my childhood and my life in general, go to my website at www.whitezulubook.com. And I hope you've all enjoyed it. Goodbye for now. Goodbye, John. We're still recording.